Welcome to Story Comic Presents, where we interview amazing storytellers and artists. This is episode 309. I'm your host, Barney Smith of StoryComic.com. We're excited to have back with us the internationally acclaimed and celebrated author of the Shattered Gates series and our good friend, BryanSGlosemeyer. Bryan.
Hello. Hey, Barney. Good to see you.
Yeah, how's it going? So Bryan, you came out with your second book in the series of the second book in this series, the Shattered Gates series.
Yes.
So talk to us a little bit about the fact that your first book that you're on 3 years ago, you're talking, I mean, it was an ebook at the time, but now it's a print book. It's sitting right behind you. That was before the Shattered Gates of Heaven. And you now came out with second volume to that book called Beyond the Gates of the Infernal. So talk to us a little bit about kind of like what the series is, get people caught up on getting some, new readers caught up to on what the series is of the Shattered Gates series is all about.
Sure. So the Shattered Gates series is it's a space opera adventure. It takes place in the far future. I like to call it an adventure through inner and outer space. So it's fast paced. There's a lot of action and big set pieces. But at the same time, I try to keep a strong focus on character and character arcs. And so it's actually also at the same time a very intimate journey of self-discovery and revelation, kind of set against the backdrop of interstellar war between these alien species that our main characters have been caught up into.
For those that are listening or watching, and if you're looking for a new sci-fi book to read, I love the fact that some of these review stats is the people that have been talking about it. Characters that you root for against all odds. Amazing space opera novel, beautiful writing, literate, fast-paced, and highly imaginative. Have you ever become lucid in a dream when you're walking the streets of another city in another world? I felt like that, as if I was there. Another one on here says, wow, a super fast and hard-hitting sci-fi book. From the beginning, this book drew me in, dropped right into a strange world. Mr. Glosemeyer has created a very tangible and alien place. This is a grand universe here, and I'm excited to see what the author has in store for us. And it goes on and on and on. You've been having amazing reviews on this book. So I guess the first question that, just to kind of remind people about it as well and ask as well, is that what do you feel makes a good story?
Wow, that's a starting off with the light questions first. Huh? Let me bust out my graduate dissertation. A good story is, I think, in first and foremost, it has to entertain, right? And entertaining can be lots of different things. Like entertaining can mean that it distracted you from the real world for a little while. Entertaining could mean that you enjoyed the artistry of it. Entertaining could mean that you were moved in some way emotionally. Like entertaining can be lots of different things for lots of different people. But I think first and foremost, like it has to be entertaining. And then I think second of all, what really impacts a good story for me, there's that sense of character and place and things, things happening, the characters making choices, usually hard choices, even if it's like a fluffy, romance story. There's always the point where the heroine has to make a choice between, the nerdy bookworm or the big gruff hunter, which one she's going to give her heart to, or however it might be. So, characters making choices that affect their lives in an entertaining way.
Right. And so one of the aspects of it is what, a lot of your reviews and what a lot of the feedback that you've gotten from the book is the fact that it's a completely alien world. So how do you create a sense of how do you create that sense of place for somebody, for the reader who's never been on the planet that you created? How do you give them that sense of familiarity for them to kind of give them that anchor point?
I really brought it through the character. And so
Okay.
that way, not only are you establishing what the world is, and the challenges and whatnot of the world, but you're establishing, the character and how they fit into that world. And so what I found was really important is just have the character living in the world that they're in,
Mm,
interacting, like who are the people they interact with, what are the challenges, what are their goals, what is holding them back and what is pushing them forward, the different influences on them in this world, what do they regularly do in this world. As also, you really people talked about, I was very touched, you read some of the reviews that really touched me, like people talked about how they could really step into this other world and feel it. And that's also in the character, like what does the character feel, what are their senses, what do they smell. I think a lot of writers, we always want to talk about, because we're so movie oriented in our
mm,
culture, and TV oriented, and so we really have culturally come to think a lot about stories visually, which is great. Like I love the visual medium, but there's so many other senses that can really ground you in a setting. Like, what does it smell like?
right.
Like, and going through those senses is world building, is a way to establish very, show don't tell of what's going on in the world. Does it smell like antiseptic cleaner? Does it smell like mechanical oils and stringent, like in the back of your throat? Does it smell like body odor? Is it crowded with people and there's just that human sweat and stink and existence? Does it smell like food? Just by going through what they are sensing, you're also world building for your reader while you're getting them, into the character's mind and the characterization that you want to take them on this journey with, all at the same time. So really grounding it in the point of view of the character. So what I did was, I did a very tight third person. So at any, like the first book only has one POV, the second book has two POVs, but for both books, like when you're in the POV, you only see, hear, feel, know what the character knows. It's not, omniscient. I didn't write it as first person, but it's almost as intimate as first person. It's almost as intimate as like I did this, I saw this. You just made it third person instead. Where she she experiences these things as she goes about her adventures. So
Mm.
really, really grounding it in the character's experience will do so much for you and do so much for the reader.
What would you say is probably one of your most interesting writing quirks?
I think this is probably true for a lot of writers, but I spend a lot of time daydreaming.
Mm,
I think I usually will often daydream a lot of scenes before I ever write them down. And so it's almost kind of getting lost in a trance for a while you're taking a shower or sitting on the couch, or if you're taking the bus, just kind of getting lost into what the scene would be and what the character would be thinking and feeling, and just kind of daydreaming through the experience. So you've kind of already, on a certain level, experienced it yourself before you ever kind of sit down and put words on the page.
what were some of the authors that kind of inspired you as you were writing this? Any like books or authors that you kind of inspired or referenced from that kind of pushed you forward on creating these worlds that you made?
Neil Stevenson. I talked about
Mm,
him in our last time we talked.
yeah.
Neil Stevenson is one of my favorite sci-fi writers, especially a lot of his more earlier stuff like Snow Crash and the Baroque Cycle. Just a lot of the ways, especially like in Snow Crash, like the energy
Right.
that he is able to convey into his writing, and just like just going for big ideas and going for lots of small ideas. I think Patrick Rothfuss. He is he's a more known as a fantasy writer. Not science fiction, but he obviously cares a lot about prose, and just the idea of there being rhythm and flow and lyricalness to the prose and to how you're writing. It can really create an effect that the writing, the prose itself should be its own artwork in addition to the art of the story, which is incredibly hard to do, and it's much, much easier to do wrong and come across really purple, and flowery and overly done, and then having to pare things back. Dan Simmons and the Hyperion books.
Oh yeah.
Again, great prose, big epic ideas, really great characters. The and you know the one that influenced everybody in this genre is Dune. Dune is the book that I've read the most. I've only read it 3 times. Like some people are like, oh yeah, I read that book 250 times. I'm not a big rereader, so to say that I've read like the same book 3 times is like, and I've read it like at different times in my life and gotten different things out of it, and had different experiences with it.
Right.
And so just trying to, or hoping that I could, write something that had so many layers to it that if people read it at different times and different parts of their life and their experience, that they would bounce off of it, or react to it, get something different out of it each
Right.
time.
And so when you sit down and write, do you feel after you spend time writing in a day, do you feel energized or do you feel drained after
Yes. It can really vary. Sometimes it can be very draining, especially if it's something that I'm kind of like struggling with, and I'm really like trying to focus and think and figure something out. Especially if like if I've hit like a plot point that doesn't seem to be working, or I'm not
right.
quite sure on how I'm going to get to A to B, or if I just feel something I'm really trying to work through, that can be very draining, which is fine.
Right.
Anything that requires a lot of work should take something out of you, energy wise. But I also found that I get a lot out of um, milestones and accomplishing something.
Mm,
So whenever I finish a chapter, or whenever I finish like a big section of a draft, that would give me kind of a little boost, a little serotonin hit. You know, just knowing that like I hit that mark, like I got X amount done. I got this chapter done, at least for the first draft or second draft or whatever. But
right.
anytime I can hit a milestone in the writing, that's when I get that kind of that rush feeling from it.
So how is your writing process different when you're writing volume 2 as compared to your than volume 1?
I went through a lot of the same things. Like I learned a lot about writing a book
Mm,
in writing book one. Like I had done a little bit of short fiction writing, and a little bit of experiments here and there before I started book one. So I definitely had some things to learn while I was doing it. So book one had a lot of stops and starts, as like how do I world build this? How
mm,
do I outline this? How do I set up a scene? Like so I once I kind of learned a lot of those lessons, especially like in the first draft of book one, I really brought those lessons into book two.
okay.
So that like I very much approached the outlining process, the scene breakdowns, character development, as well as editing. It was all actually like what I learned from book one. So there wasn't a big change so much as just building off of what was already learned.
What were some of the lessons that you learned from book one that you're able to put into book two that made the process smoother for you then?
That's a good question. I think I had a better idea of how to pace and how to structure. I think when I first started writing book one, in some of those early chapters, I felt like, oh, and I came to realize, oh, these chapters are actually a little bit too long. And if I cut them right about like where to cut a chapter, like
Hmm.
where to get up like to a real good tension point, and then cut it there so that like the reader's like, but wait, what's happening? So kind of pull into the next chapter. And there's really kind of no way to learn that without just like doing it.
Hmm. Right.
Obviously you can always learn by reading good writers and paying attention to good stories, paying close attention, but getting in there and doing it. So just how to, I felt like the pacing in a lot of ways was a lesson learned that I was able to bring to the second book. Where to bring chapter ends at and things like that.
Right. And so, because in here, so like I said, it's sci-fi. This is space. This isn't fantasy. And you're dealing with different alien races. You're differing with space battles and all this stuff. How has your writing? How have you seen? What were some of the more complicated aspects writing sci-fi brings that you wouldn't find in a normal, say, fiction book?
I just want to say I think a lot of fantasy readers will appreciate it. Like in
Mm,
a lot, even though it's put into like the sci-fi space opera setting, in a lot of ways it's structured like an epic fantasy.
right.
Um, like there's lots of what could happen in this book be transferred to like a more fantastical setting, and just swap out spaceships for sailing ships, and swap
Right.
out magic this for sci-fi that, in a lot of ways.
Right.
Um, but one thing you need to is that trying to think about capturing technology that would be thousands of years in the future, you know, that would still be comprehensible to a reader today. So I think we're very inundated in sci-fi right now, which I think is really helpful. I mean, you can watch like I think like one of the Transformers movies like brought up the subject of smart matter or like programmable matter, so that you could just like have matter and turn it whatever you want. You could have a boombox turn into a rubber ball, kind of thing. So just you could program the matter and however you want it to be and adapt it to be for the situation.
Right.
So just a few years ago, I think that would have been like a really tricky idea to get across. But now, like ideas like that, these far future crazy sci-fi ideas are so inundated with us. Like if you look at like the old like Star Trek,
Right.
with the exception of like transporters and faster than light travel, we have all that tech now. It's like we can do pretty much what they were doing in Star Trek, except for transporting matter and zipping around the stars. But everything
Right.
else, we pretty much got it.
Right. Yeah.
But didn't take hundreds of years. It just took a few decades.
Right.
So trying to think of a technological world that was thousands of years advanced, that would make sense to us, and that would be coherent within the world. Because like once you change one thing, the ripple effects just flow out.
Right.
Just when they were first coming up with the internet protocols in the 60s, for how to network two computers to each other, and they were able to just get like one, like I think they got like two characters and they got LO before the whole thing fell apart. And they're trying to send a message to each other. Just like how that, and just 60 years later, what a transformative thing it's had on
Right.
world and all of our cultures around the world, and like things they could never have thought of, like smartphones and apps, and much less social media, and what social media is doing to us, and like child development and all of that. So just trying to extrapolate a believable world from technological with these technological changes, that also you don't spend hundreds of pages just trying to describe that, so it
Right.
gets boring. You think you keep your characters in the world, and then how like different cultures will have different technologies and different technological changes, and how that impacts them, and how that feeds back as they interact with each other. It just becomes a very kind of complex uh, mesh in the background while you're trying to tell these stories about characters and their inner drives and desires and whatnot.
How do you pivot that creativity with um, real life experience in the world that you've created?
Well, I think write what you know is actually pretty tricky advice. It's like super common writing
Mm,
advice. And I think in a lot of ways it's a trap, um, if it's approached incorrectly, especially if you're like a genre writer, a sci-fi or
right.
fantasy writer. Because I don't know anything about space battles, or alien technology, or alien religions, or what the world's going to be like in thousands of years from now. Um, but I do know what it's like to be in my early 20s and trying to find myself. I do know what it's like to have a certain upbringing, and then have like a kind of crisis of faith in that worldview. To encounter, I do know what it's like to encounter cultures, and encounter places that I haven't been to before. I have traveled. So I think write what you know, especially for genre writers, is write what you know from your internal experience. You know, like write what you know about being in a relationship. Write what you know about having a friend betray you. Write what you
Mm,
know about wanting to fit in, and then put that very real world, real life stuff of your characters into this stuff that you could have no way of knowing about, with space battles and aliens and crazy technology.
mm. Give people a little bit of a synopsis on volume two is, and do you have to read volume one before reading volume two?
So volume two picks up literally right where volume one leaves off. There's even a
Okay.
little bit of overlap where we see part of the ending from a different point of view.
Okay.
So there is a lot of context, that it comes from having read the first volume. And ideally, you would read them. You would read them back to back. Um, that being said, I also wanted to give people a chance that there's always a thing where like, oh, what's this book, and you pick it up and you start reading, and it's like, oh, it's a sequel, and then but you've already started reading it. So I wanted to give people a chance to have an understanding of some context of what was going on. So I do try to give people the bare minimum of what they would need to know if they hadn't read the first book, to get them up to speed, when they start if they start reading book two. And even though it is a continuation, like plot wise, like it picks up right where book one leaves off, book two is still its own story.
Okay.
I wanted to make sure that it had its own conflicts, its own beginning, middle, and end. That it was not just you know an iteration in a series. That it really was its own story and its own book. And as I eventually write more books in this series, that's really important to me. Is that I want to tell a bigger, longer multi-volume story, but each volume, has to have its own bookness, its own story qualities.
As we're wrapping up, give people a little bit of like a synopsis on the your Shattered Gates series.
I've already got it here on the back, so why not go up with the
Right.
back?
There you go.
So, growing up in the lowest of the low in a cruel alien underworld, Sabira dreams of something more than being forever unseen, toiling in tunnels and mines, and never seeing the sky. She dreams of a life of honor, glory, and conquest among the stars. She has only one way to make her dreams come true: victory in the deadly fighting pits of the divine masters. So this is very much like a personal story of revelation of someone trying to a human trying to find themselves in a very dystopian, dark, and in many ways cruel
Mm,
alien world, but who is also a firm believer in that world, and then along the way has some crisis of faith, um, and everything that she's been told about the universe and her people and her culture and like her place in the universe, and things blow up. So the second book is the continuation of her story, um, where she has a newfound family, and new goals, a new society that she is trying to get to and reach, um, but her old family and her old society isn't quite done with her yet.
mm,
And a lot of it is about the conflict of, how does she, as a warrior, how does she protect her new family from her old one,
okay.
and what will that mean, and what will that draw her to? And meanwhile, older and mysterious forces are waking up and are at play and have their own agenda for them. And so, like I said, the second book actually has two POVs. Um,
Wow. Okay.
I really like the idea, the kind of the trope of the antagonist being the protagonist of their own story. So that's how I approached book two, uh, where it's two POVs, and we get Sabira again from the first book, but we also get Daguerre, who's a minor character in the first book, um, as she has her, as the events of the first book kind of have their own fallout for her and what it means uh, for Daguerre, and so they're each pursuing their own goals and how those goals counteract each other and
Okay.
their relationship with each other. Um, so I don't like saying hero and villain as much as each is their own protagonist and each is the antagonist to the other.
So Bryan, if people want to learn more about the Shattered Gates series, or if people want to learn more about you, where is the best place they could go to?
Just go to BryanSGlosemeyer.com. Just my full name.com. That'll get to that page. That'll give you links to the books. And you can also sign up for my monthly newsletter, the Deep Void Transmissions. And each newsletter, I like to just kind of talk about what's going on with me creatively,
Okay.
my thoughts on different media and stories that I'm reading or movies that I'm watching, um, and how I think people who have liked my books would think about them or feel about them, and also give you some uh, discounts and deals for some upcoming other indie authors that I know and that I work with. So sign up for the newsletter.
Cool.
You'll get all that. You'll get a free short story that's set in the Shattered Gates universe. It's its own story. You don't have to read it. It's its own characters, but does offer a little extra insight into the ending of book 2. So if you sign up for the newsletter, get a free short story. You'll get a little bit more for when you get to book 2 than people who haven't read it.
Thank you so much for coming back on. And when is book 3 coming out? Because then we gotta plan on that
Well,
too.
it takes me about 3 years to write a book so far. You don't know, about 3 years. I am not a fast writer. I thank God I'm not at George Martin speed.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, it does take me a while. I am in the process of kind of outlining and figuring things out for book 3 and for some other books and projects in that same universe. So I'm not making any promises yet. I also say if you're on social media, if you want to find me on social media, the best way to find me is on Instagram, BryanSGlosemeyer, or at Doom Bunny Bryan. That's Bryan with a Y. On Instagram, that's the social media that I'm most often on. BryanSGlosemeyer .com or Facebook.com/BryanSGlosemeyer, however Facebook works. But Instagram is where I'm most often at. Someone just gave me a Blue Sky hookup, so I haven't got that going yet. So maybe I'll be on Blue Sky soon. We'll see about that.
Blue Sky sounds very much like a BryanSGlosemeyer-esque
Yeah.
platform anyway, because you got Shattered Gates, you got the Heaven, Shattered Gates of Heaven, Void Form Media. Everything just seems very airy, so Blue Sky seems to fit for you. See, anyway.
I'll take it. Sure. Ragged skies of doom.
Well, perfect. Well, thanks a lot, Bryan. It was great chatting with you again.
Thanks having me on, Barney. It's good to see you. It's good to be on, and maybe I'll see you in another 300 episodes.
Yeah, there we go. We got a good rhythm going here. All right, let's do the intro. We'll get going. This is just a pre-show banter. See, I got all good.
Pre-show banter.
See,
4 minutes of banter.
Yeah, we're all seasoned professionals now at this. See, it's what it is. Yeah.
I know you've been doing this 300 times.
Yeah. See, look at that. Yeah. What's it take? So here's the thing. What does it take? Without the 10,000 hours, so if you do something for 10,000 hours, then you can get then you're an expert in it.
Yeah, that's the common wisdom.
So yeah, so after episode 10,000, then I'll be good at this.